Samuel Beckett, born in 1906 in Dublin, later in life travels to Paris, which really becomes his home. He goes there to study under James Joyce. And you can see some parallels in their writing, some similar questioning in their writing. He stays in Paris. He is part of the French resistance and ends up actually going into hiding for a time. He writes Waiting for Godot in the late 40s, appears in French as En attendant Godot in 1953, I believe. And in fact, that translation of the word Godot, the name Godot, leads to this ongoing conversation, which we had at our table, in fact, about the pronunciation of the word Godot. Because, of course, in French, you emphasize both of the syllables, but once you change it into English, you have to question, are you going to say Godot or Godot? It's a long and tiresome conversation, but Daniel Brooks has some good answers to that question, so we'll refer back to that later on. So it premieres in French in 1953. It premieres in English, directed by Peter Hall, the late, great Peter Hall, in 1955 in England. Peter Hall famously, I'm paraphrasing, but famously says early in rehearsal, "Darlings, I don't entirely know what any of it means, but if we stop and talk about every single line, we'll never open." And so they do open to much acclaim in 1955. It was voted in 1990 by the Dramatists Guild in England or something like that as the most influential play of the 20th century. So I'm very excited to introduce to you the Bailey Fellow here at Soulpepper. He has been the artistic director of Necessary Angel Theatre Company. He has won the Siminovich Prize, which is the greatest prize in Canadian theatre. He is the Barker Fairley Distinguished Visitor at U of T. Does that mean you just visit occasionally? How does that work?
And I'm only fairly distinguished.
The wonderful director of tonight's performance, Daniel Brooks. So, Daniel, have you directed this before? You haven't.
You know what? I've never seen a production of it.
Never seen a production of Waiting for Godot.
No.
But you love Beckett.
Yeah.
You directed Endgame here at Soulpepper. You've done it twice here.
Why do I love Beckett?
Yeah. Why do you love Beckett?
Because, I don't know. First of all, he's an unbelievably clever linguist. So the construction of every line in this play is a kind of witty little poem. I'm just going to repeat myself, if that's okay. Yeah, someone described Waiting for Godot as a bag of broken mirrors. And I think that's real. I mean, it's more dynamic than an inert bag of broken mirrors. It's a bag of broken mirrors that Santa Claus is waving around, let's say. Because every moment and every word and every line has a reflection of another line or of another moment. And every idea is reflected in another idea. So sometimes you don't know when you're watching the play if you're hearing a thing for the first time or you're hearing a reflection of a reflection or what. And I feel that it's very hard to talk about Beckett because I think, for myself anyway, I'm absolutely reticent to reduce it to anything. And even to say that is a kind of reduction. But I think that his great gift is a kind of engagement with the joys and delights and, of course, the suffering of humanity, and his understanding of intellectual movements and how we use our reason, but I believe he sees reason as a kind of fantasy, basically, so that any kind of philosophical system, Christianity is one of the major themes in the play, I think, and that Beckett is looking at our culture, or certainly a post-Second World War culture in Europe, in which Christianity is on the decline, and the idea of God is perhaps less accessible to people than it may have been in the past. And I don't think the play is for or against God. I don't think there is anything to do with a reduction to that kind of thinking. But I believe heart of what he's looking at is a world in which a inherited culture is struggling with its own mythology. He lived through the Second World War. He worked in the French Resistance. He saw a lot of destruction. I believe he worked in a hospital late in the war. Anyway, clearly Europe was in big trouble, and the whole idea of these nations that comprised Europe that were decimated, and the ideas that supported these nations, which were to some degree from the Judeo-Christian tradition, were falling apart. And I believe we're still living in that world in which I won't go into the world we're living in, because here we are, hi. But he struggled with, I believe, a world in tremendous transition, and I don't think he would ever, that his great spiritual discipline, I think, has to do with never allowing himself to fall into false belief. And so his characters struggle with belief, they struggle with physical suffering, they struggle with time. They struggle with, for instance, me right in this moment. I look out now and see you, and that has some impact on my body and my mind and how my mind is now thinking. And then now I'm a little lost, and now I'm thinking, go back to Christ, that's easy. And he writes about the moment of existence and presents, I think, a beautiful challenge to his audience. And as I was saying earlier, I think children are the most receptive to Beckett. Because Beckett is partially constantly challenging all of our assumptions about, not only about religion, relationships, but about theater, about story and how we perceive story, and how we exist in time. So I'll stop.
That's beautiful. Your talk about time makes me think there are famously a number of productions of Godot that have been staged in prisons. Mm-hmm. First in a German prison, and then twice, I think, at San Quentin. Yeah, well, the play, it's also, and people don't talk about this a lot, it's partially about power. And I think it's, you could very easily take the Pozzo character and put a little orange wig on him, and then, pat yourself on the back for doing a very contemporary production. Everybody gets the orange wig reference? Yeah, sure. Because it's partially about, there's something about the way that power functions in the world in the play that I'd be curious to know. I'm not going to talk about it because I'd be actually curious to know how you experience how power works in the play. And I put power in quotation marks, not in a moral sense, but just literal power. Someone has power over someone else. Mm-hmm. And what the exercise of power being witnessed by a third party, how it affects the third party. Beckett captures that process of how power corrupts other people around power. And you'll see that in the play. It's subtle, but it's there. It's quite incredible. So Beckett is a incredibly dense matrix of interests, and he's also very funny, and he's a great poet, and I wish I had met him.